all fit up for this reading today. I wanted to check out Michaelmas more because that sounds cool. And then I realized it says Christ's Mass is why we call it Christmas. And Michael's Mass, like a mass. I get it. Now I get it. There's so much out there to learn. It's so crazy. Michael's Mass. It's a shortened name for Michaelmas Day. Why did we stop celebrating Michaelmas? Despite once being a popular and important part of the calendar, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is what killed off the celebrations of Michaelmas. A factory worker in urban life increasingly became the lot of the common folk, and the agricultural year and his traditions became less important. That's awful. The feast is observed annually as September 29th by Anglicans. I don't know who those people are or where they are, but it says Western Christians, so I've never heard of it my whole entire life. Michaelmas celebrations, you'll find food, dancing, music, games, and a lot, in bold, a lot of enthusiasm. In the old time, festivals were held to enjoy the fruits of the labor and to say thank you. Most of our ancestors' times was spent working to provide food and shelter. Right. What to eat on Michaelmas? There's also duck. There's one food above all others that is associated with Michaelmas, the goose, duck, goose. Google's getting fun. On Michaelmas of 1588, according to one legend, Elizabeth I was chowing down on some roast goose, one of her favorite meals, when she was brought news of England's victory over the Spanish Armada. Happy Michaelmas, everybody! And there are beautiful little purple flowers called Michaelmas daisies, and they're really, really cute purple flowers. So I'll encourage you, everybody, this year to plant some Michaelmas flowers and eat goose. And my friend named Michael just passed away in 2022, and I'll just celebrate him, and it'll be a fun Michaelmas day. He actually died, wow, September 22nd? No, September 11th, 2022. So it's close enough. Have my little coffee. It's a beautiful sunny winter day here in Sacramento, California. Sunny, wintry, probably a good 50, 62 degrees. And we're on chapter 7 in our book. Let's dive back into the Pride and Prejudice world, huh? This Regency era book. Let's just escape into this book. I'd love to be an Audible book reader, but I mean, clearly it's much harder than it sounds because I've just been stuttering the whole time, and also like creating whole characters. Like you basically have to be an actor. But there is something that I like about the messiness of this, of like reading a book and it not being perfect. But I do see why people on Audible have to make their book perfect. You're like reading somebody else's creation and you're like, oh, what's that word? Like I do. I'm like, ew, what's that word? Chapter 7. So we know Mr. Bingley's there. Everybody's going to meet him, and they've already met him, and they went to a ball, and Mr. Darcy was awful and terrible. And let's continue on. And we also know that people were just gentlemen back in the day, so they just had time to like hang out, which sounds very, I'm sure it was awful for some people back in that time. I'm going to do one more thing because I was a bit curious about this before we started. We, meaning I. What else was going, because I need to be more of a world time thinker. Just what else, what were the big events of the 1700s? Hold on. Around the world. Yeah, I just don't want to think about what? Englishman sailor James Cook concludes his inaugural and embarks on his second voyage, leaving a trail of significant milestones along the way, such as the discovery of New Caledonia, Australia, Tahiti, and the Antarctic Circle. and becoming one of the first humans to witness Antarctic waters. Whoa. Wow. Parliament, yes. America, right. Blah, blah, blah. Historical events. The Boston Massacre, obviously. Wow. Many things were happening. The European slave trade with Africa reaches its peak. Gosh, okay. The end of the 70 Years' War, the passage of the Stamp Act, British troops occupy Boston. Okay, so a lot of things happening in America at the time. Let's be in England whenever this was. I also looked up that thing about Mr. Darcy being autistic, and it was just funny to me because I work with a lot of autistic people, and I didn't even think about that until I saw that thing on Google, but I clicked on it. Was Mr. Darcy autistic? And it did say, Mr. Darcy is a fictional character, so we cannot diagnose him. I thought, that's right. Okay, Chapter 7, Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely of an estate of £2,000 a year, which unfortunately for his daughters was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation. See, I did read this and forgot about it and didn't understand. It didn't understand. Like, his estate, well, like, right. That's what he did. He had an estate, and that's how he made his money. And it is entailed, which means it's given to a male heir. It says it right here on the page. And their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton and had left her £4,000. Wow, I wonder if that could go a long way back then. Sounds like it could, kind of. She had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London in a respectable line of trade. That's that. In a respectable line of trade. Good for him. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week to pay their duty to their aunt and a milliner's shop. I don't know what a milliner is. Milliner's shop just over the way. All the information is right in the book. You just have to slow down when you read, because when I'm reading, I'm like, just get through it. I'm going to look up what a milliner is later. Milliner. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters. I have a vacant mind. That's funny. And when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversations for the evening. And however bare of news the country in general might be, they always contrived to learn some from their aunt. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of the militia regiment in the neighbourhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Meryton was the headquarters. I also think while I was reading this book specifically, I was waiting for things to happen in the book that I saw happen in the movie, of things that I liked. Like when she was talking about, you just throw your handkerchief and they pick it up and then you're introduced. And I didn't find that in the book, so I was like, when is that going to happen? So I was just reading to find scenes from the movie that were never in the book. Should have read the book first. But we're reading it now. Okay. The visit to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr. Phillips visited them all, and this opened to his nieces a store of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but the officers and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. Hold on. I'm going to look up milliners first. Milliners. It sounds like a person who makes or sells women's hats. I thought that was a haberdasher, but maybe it's just specific to a woman's. A milliner is a hat maker. What's the difference between a hatter and a milliner? A milliner is a hat maker specializing in women's headwear and works in a millinery shop. Am I saying it right? Oh, it's right there.
Milliner.
Milliner. Whoa, she got...
Milliner.
Milliner. Okay, that was very breathy. Okay, what is ensign? Ensign? An infantry officer of what was formerly the lowest commissioned rank. A junior rank of a commissioned officer in the armed forces of some countries, normally the infantry or navy. Okay, ensign, I don't know if I'm saying it right. Good to know. Ensign and milliner. A milliner is a person who makes women's hats. I just had no idea. I thought a haberdasher was a hat maker also, but that wasn't in there, but... Okay. Ensign. After listening one more to their effusions on the subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but now I am convinced." He was doing his own meta-research. He was doing his own research about if they were the silliest girls in the world. And they are. Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer, but Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter and her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it." "Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever." "This is to the point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our two youngest daughters uncommonly foolish." I love the way they talk to each other. That's really funny. "My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and indeed so I do still at my heart. And if a smart young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I shall not say no to him. And I thought Colonel Foster looked very becoming the other night at Sir William's in his regimentals." "Wow." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Foster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out while her daughter read. "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it out loud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." That's so funny that like, everything was so dramatic back then. She said, "We'll be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives." And the first time I read this, I did have to look up tete-a-tete because I'd heard it a lot of times in my life, but, you know, you never know, like, what does it really mean? Like a tete-a-tete, like a back and forth, like a whatever. It's like a head-to-head. But the guy who was, like, translating it, he was like, "In France, they say tete-a-tete, and in English, they say tete-a-tete." Like, American English people say things like we're slow. It was just slower. It was like the same pronunciation, just slower. "With the officers!" cried Lydia. "I wonder if my aunt did not tell us that." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky. Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, but it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night. That's a good scheme, said Elizabeth, if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home. Oh, but the gentleman will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs. I had much rather go in the coach. But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are they not? They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them. But if you have to go to them if you have got them today, said Elizabeth, my mother's purpose will be answered. She did at last resort from her father an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. This was a lucky idea of mine indeed, said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when the servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of me returning till I am better. My kind friends will not hear of me returning. Oh, I just read that. Great. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and expecting a sore throat and headache, and accepting a sore throat and headache. There is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in the pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders. Oh, I am not afraid of her dying. People don't die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage. I get the carriage and she does not. She has to be sick, but this is all the plan. Thanks, Mom. This is wild. Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and as she was no horsewoman, walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing, in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want. Is this a hint to me, Lizzie, said her father, to send for the horses? No, indeed, I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive, only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner. I admire the activity of your benevolence, observed Mary, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and in my opinion exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. We'll go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia, as Elizabeth accepted their company, and the 3 young ladies set off together. If we make haste, said Lydia, as they walked along, perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes. And Meryton departed. The 2 youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and finding herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shown into the breakfast parlour, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness. There was good humour and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hertz nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. Mr. Hertz. That's funny. Breakfast. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favourably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish, and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth was glad to be taken to her immediately, and Jane, who had only been withheld by the fear of giving alarm or inconvenience from expressing it in her note, how much she longed for such a visit, was delighted at her entrance. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little besides expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness she was treated with. Elizabeth silently attended her. I feel like people back then did die of colds, though. I mean, don't they, like, it, like, turns to pneumonia, and then somebody has to, like... I mean... Okay. When were antibiotics created? By Fleming? Some man named Fleming... Or penicillin, okay, hold on just a second. When were antibiotics invented? Oh, this is silly. In 1910. This was so many years. Oh. Yeah, so how did they treat infections before antibiotics? With arsenic, which is how Jane died, Jane Austen. Whoa, do you think that's why she made Jane sick? Because she was sick? Ooh, that's interesting. Jane Austen got sick, and she named a character who got sick, but then got married to one of the richest guys. That's sweet, to kind of, like, interject yourself into a world. That's fun for a writer. That could be cool. She was like, yeah, she got sick, and then she got over it, and she's like, I died from arsenic poisoning. Naturally occurring chemical elements and chemical compounds have historically been used as therapies for a variety of infections. Iodine, bromine, and mercury containing compounds were used to... Ooh, mercury. Thanks. Well, that's interesting for me. That's very interesting for me. When breakfast was over, did I already read that? I don't know. Didn't quite impact nothing. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. I did look this up before, and I already forgot what it meant, and I'm just going to go back to that word, care and concern for someone or something. I was touched by his solicitude. She uses this word a lot. Do you think that authors, like, learn a word and they're like, I'm going to use this in my book? And she uses this word so much. I'm going to, like, page 27 was which we first see it. We're going to clock how many times she uses it, because it's a lot. How much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. The apothecary came, and having examined his patient, said, as he might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavour to get better of it, advised her to return to bed, and promised her some draughts. The advice was followed readily, for the feverish symptoms increased, and her head ached acutely. Elizabeth did not quit her room for a moment, nor with other ladies often absent, the gentlemen being out. They had, in fact, nothing to do elsewhere. The gentlemen being out, they had, in fact, nothing to do elsewhere. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. Miss Bennet offered her the carriage. That's nice, and she only wanted a little pressing to accept it. When Jane testified such concern in parting with her, that Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer of the chaise to an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present, Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring back a supply of clothes. It's very nice. Shall we do one more chapter? Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30 Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves. Dude, ditto. It's like, all you want is to get better. And then thought no more of the matter. They'd said what they said, and that's that. And their indifference towards Jane would not immediately before them restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all their former dislike. They said, oh, that totally sucks. Anyway, what else is going on? Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. Her anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. That's a terrible feeling. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy. Her sister scarcely less so, and as for Mr. Hertz, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man who lived to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her to prefer plain dish to a ragout, had nothing to say to her. I think that says ragout. Rag out is what it looks like. But I'm sure it's not rag out. Is that just what they called a ragout back then? Ragout. French style stew that is slow cooked and well seasoned, featuring meat and fish and Is a ragout the same as ragout? The difference between ragout and ragot, or maybe it's O-U-T, ragot, isn't really much. It's not much. A ragout is Italian pasta sauce. And a ragot, I'm sure it's pronounced ragot. Let's just look up the pronunciation and we can move on, I promise. There we go. No. Pronunciation. Oh, it's another 1 minute long video. That's just crazy.
It is generally said as ragout, French, ragout.
Ragout. It's ragout. Okay. It is ragout, but it's French, not Italian. Got it. He said, oh, you don't like a ragout? I'm not talking to you. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no beauty. Mrs. Hertz thought the same and added, she has nothing in short to recommend her but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really almost looked wild. These women. She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister has a cold? Her hair so untidy, so blousy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud. I'm absolutely certain. And the gown which had been let down to hide in not doing its office. These women. Your picture may be very exact, Louisa, said Bingley, but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice. You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I'm sure, said Miss Bingley, and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition. Certainly not. To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing, said Bingley. I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy, observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied. They were brightened by the exercise. A short pause followed his speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. Oh, my gosh. I have an excessive regard for Miss Bennet Jane. Dyslexia? We're not going to be diagnosing me here. I have an excessive regard for Miss Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart that she was well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I'm afraid there is no chance of it. I think I've heard you say that their uncle's an attorney on Meryton. Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside. That is capital, added his sister, and they both laughed heartily. If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, cried Bingley, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. It feels like it stings more deeply in this manner of speaking. Like it feels like they're really getting. Nowadays people are just like, she sucks, and you're like, yeah, and they're like, no, this is very detailed why they don't like her, and it's very like, you just met these people. To this speech Bingley made no answer. Oh no. Okay, I missed something that Darcy said. I have to go back. But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. It must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. Whoa. What does that mean? It lessens their chance of... Whoa. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it to their hearty assent, and indulging their mirth for some time at the expense of their dearest friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they returned to her room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep, and when it seemed to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" he said. "That's rather singular." "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She's a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else." "I deserve neither such praise nor censure," cried Elizabeth. "I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." "In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure," said Bingley, "and I hope it will be soon increased by seeing her quite well." Elizabeth thanked him. I didn't realize Mr. Bingley was here. Okay. When they just say Bingley, it means him and not Miss Bingley. Okay. Interesting. Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards the table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all his library afforded. "And I wish my collections were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into." Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. "I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." Wow. "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." "I've neglected my family library. What a mistake in these times." That's so funny. "Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley." "I wish it may. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in the neighbourhood, and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There's nothing finer country in England than Derbyshire. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire. With all my heart I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles." "Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than imitation." Elizabeth was so much caught with what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his elder sister to observe the game. "Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring?" said Miss Bingley. "Will she be as tall as I am?" "I think she will now. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller." How I long to see her again! I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite. It is amazing to me, said Bingley, how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are. All young ladies are accomplished, my dear Charles. What do you mean? Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I've never heard of a young lady spoken for the first time without being informed that she is very accomplished. Your list of common extent of accomplishments. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth. The word is applied to too many a women who deserve it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you that in your estimate of ladies in general, I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished. Nor I am sure, said Miss Bingley. Then, observed Elizabeth, you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman. Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it. Oh, certainly, cried his faithful assistant. No one can be really esteemed accomplishment who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern language to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address, and expressions. Or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at you only knowing 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe united. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going on forward. He's like, where's the food? He loves food. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. Elizabeth Bennet, said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own. And with many men, I dare say, it succeeds, but in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art. Paltry. Sorry, paltry. Because it almost sounds like she's saying the word poultry, so I just think of chicken. And I'm certain that's not what she means, obviously. We're just going to say paltry. Context cues would give me something not good. Small or meager, petty or trivial. Paltry. Navel going. Poultry. 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 There's many I dare say, but it's a paltry device. Petty, trivial device, a very mean art. Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. There is a meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condense to employ for captivation. To cunning is despicable. Whoa. Elizabeth had joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse and that she could not leave. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sister, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so willing to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. When would the sick person get better? God! They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief in his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. Oh, that's the end of the chapter. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst are Awful. Boy. Oy vey. Okay. Happy reading, everyone. Thanks for reading and listening.